it illuminated something I think I've always felt, that evidence and feedback were often the missing component in turning teaching into effective learning.
Delighted to welcome one of our very strong PTC trainers, Ron Lalonde. This coming year, Ron's going to be the high school principal at the American School of Dubai. He's previously served there as a middle school principal, as well as in Monterrey, Mexico. He's also the founder of his own consulting group called Rivers Path Consulting. If you ever do get a chance, tap him, because he's got just a wealth. And he's also been a really influential player in this whole notion of positive education. And we at the PTC rely on him for that background. He teaches our instructional supervision and evaluation course. And that course, we often refer to it as the watershed course for those moving into school leadership. And Ron is today going to offer a pearl based on all those many experiences that you have just heard about. Ron?
Thanks, Bambi. Great to be with you. Good morning, and hello to everyone, wherever you may be. I'm coming to you from Canada, near Bancroft, Ontario. We traded in our quarantine in Dubai for quarantine in Canada. So my family and I are here, and we were fortunate to be able to fly and to be able to be in Canada for a few weeks this summer, even though the first two are in Cornwall, who is out there and who is maybe not able to travel this summer and is making the best of staying in your location and continuing to learn, but I hope also getting a good break and getting ready for the year ahead. I want to share with you today a bit of an origin story. Really, it has to do with how I got into supervision and how I got into administration and how I got into school leadership. Prior to moving into international school teaching, I taught in Canada for 2 years in the public system. I enjoyed the relationships with students. I worked really hard. I did everything I could to foster engagement. I think I had good ideas. I thought I had okay classroom management and students who were enjoying my classes. What I didn't have was a good idea of what other educators were doing. I taught that it's kind of like teaching in a shipping container. So the one I taught in was balanced on the edge of a hill on the school's backyard. So there was little chance that another adult was going to happen by there. When my principal finally scheduled a time to visit me, I was pretty hungry for approval and suggestions. That first evaluation was very much what I was looking for. It was almost entirely the principal's reflection on what I was doing well and what I needed to improve. I kind of called it pat, 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 and don't do that. So the principal probably talked for 95% of the time, and maybe 5% of the time I was answering a few questions. This was probably February of my first year of teaching. So I want to counter that with my first year in international schools, because it really transformed things for me. I was in Monterrey, Mexico, and I was surprised when my supervisor reached out to me in mid-September to schedule his first visit to my classroom. I was even more shocked when he said before his visit he wanted to pre-conference with me and kind of let me know what the evaluation was going to be like, what the supervision was going to be like. And then I was even further shocked when he said we're going to follow up and pre-book a meeting so that after the lesson we can talk about what had gone on there. So when that supervisor came to that post-conference with me and sat across from me, I was waiting for my pat, pat, pat. And to my surprise, my supervisor, Jeff, took his observation notes and turned them toward me. It was a sheet of data outlining who had spoken, who had asked questions, what I had replied. And then he just asked me, how does this line up with what you were expecting to happen? And I credit that really with being the moment that everything shifted for me as a teacher. He gave me the responsibility to tell the story of what I was intentionally doing in the classroom. He made that presupposition, and I think a presupposition we should all be able to make in our schools, that the teacher is intentional and is trying to achieve a certain amount of learning in the class. So that first experience of then having to tell the story of my learning and having to have it measure up to the data, I needed to provide evidence for what I was doing. It illuminated something I think I've always felt. That evidence and feedback were often the missing component in turning teaching into effective learning. So that was my story. That supervision experience really put the responsibility for learning on me, put the responsibility for what was going on in the classroom on me. My supervisor, and that was Jeff Barrington, who's now the high school principal at the International School of Kuala Lumpur. I had the good fortune then to go into administration with Jeff and to develop a supervision system further in Monterey that really worked on the principles of honoring teachers and having high expectations for them, to set intentions, to set objectives for their lessons. And then supervision became very much about helping them tell their stories in light of the data that we were able to present to them. So I've done that now, I think, in 3 schools where I've helped develop the supervision and evaluation system. And then in my consulting work, probably a further 5 schools. And key to all those systems has been a focus on teacher growth and helping teachers have clear goals for development. They've also all focused on creating more dialogue about quality teaching and learning. So the supervision systems have built into it kind of these protocols for these conversations. More personally, it's made me a strong advocate for this happening, not just from the supervisor, but from everybody in the school. How do we create teacher mentorship? How do we create coaching in schools so that teachers are talking about the effectiveness of their lessons with people who are in the classroom seeing what's going on? My takeaways as a supervisor from that experience were a lot. As a teacher, they were a lot, but even more as a supervisor. I learned to let the teacher tell the story of what's happening in the classroom. I learned to provide data of my own observations so that the teacher can construct evidence from what was happening or what was not happening. And then I learned to ask questions out of genuine curiosity to help the two measure up. When you conduct an interaction like this, what I've found is what you end up measuring is the reflective capacity of the teacher. It lets you know how a teacher thinks, how they respond to data, how they make adjustments. It's that tool that as a supervisor helps create the confidence that you know what's going on in that classroom the 99.9% of the time that you're not there. So as a supervisor, you're a limited resource. Being able to have these conversations builds confidence of knowing what's happening and maybe where you need to direct your energy. If the story leaves you unsure or unconvinced, you know how to be directive, you know where to add your support and where to reteach expectations to teachers. It helps you really be also find your most effective teachers and find ways to share their ideas across the whole school. So really for me, it was the experience of good supervision that really put me in the frame of mind to become a school administrator or a school leader. And I think when teachers have great supervisory experiences that feel like dialogue, that feel like co-constructing learning, it helps them become better leaders, whether they take on administrative roles or leadership roles, or just become better leaders of their classroom. So thanks. That's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you so much, Ron. Such a critical topic. We all know that the most important thing in school is the quality of the teaching. So as a principal, of course, you would hope that the majority of the principal's time is focused on that quality of teaching. And like always, we always have this question that looms out there. How do we keep both the focus on growth, because it is about professional growth, as you explained, but also accountability? Right. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with trying to sort of blend they're both important. We know that, the principal has the obligation to make sure that there is a quality teacher in every classroom, every hour for every kid. And how do we balance that with the obvious need and focus on growth and self-reflection?
Right. Well, the thing that made Jeff's conversation possible, and if you think about it from people who've had cognitive coaching or other training, when he slid that paper to me, what he was creating was the third point. It wasn't about him and me. It was about the two of us looking at data, and we could only look at that data if we had shared standards. And so the conversation could only take place because the school had built, and not just built, but socialized a system of expectations for teachers. Back in those days, we had like 3 to 5 really specific points we were hitting on in that school year. And those were the things that, Jeff's data had focused on. So almost by the lens that he was going through, he was focusing on what was most important and inviting me to look at those standards. So he wasn't just telling me the standards, we shared the standards because the school had constructed them and took the time to socialize them so the teachers were really aware of them. So the other thing I'd say is that initial conversation where you develop that relationship with the teacher and also figure out how reflective they are is a point where, as a supervisor, you decide kind of where's that teacher on the spectrum? Can I really let them run free because they've got the idea and they can really grow and develop, and I can trust that's going to happen? Or maybe they didn't have a lot to say and I need to socialize the ideas of the school more and the expectations, or maybe even in some cases be more directive because we just weren't seeing things that were shared standards for the school.
So for all of you out there, just want you to capture that last notion that for you to have an effective supervision growth program in your school, you've got to have standards, expectations for teachers that are widely known. Correct, Ron? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the absence of that, that's where you get the feeling, if it's not transparent and it's not known by teachers, it's only guarded by the administration or supervision of the school, that's when supervision and evaluation feels like it's being done to teachers. I think they get the sense it's being done to them. And whenever that happens, people are less likely to take on personal responsibility for it, believe that it's about their growth and their development, believe that it's about better learning. They just think it's a hoop to jump through. So yeah, the standards actually create the shared responsibility.
Yeah. And the second part that you mentioned, the socialization of those, in other words, putting them in a handbook on page 1 that nobody ever looks at, not integrating them into the processes that we're going to use to get to that growth and get to that quality. So those are two, I think, really, really critical, takeaways. We do have a few other questions that are coming in. One has to do with any book recommendations, and I would recommend that if you do have those, why don't you put them into the resources page that we're sharing with people, rather than that's one way to do that. And of course, we have the question, can you speak to suggested supervision modifications in an online teaching reality? I think we all have that on our minds now that a portion of the instructional practice is happening online. How do we manage that? Yeah.
I didn't conduct them this spring. I was still working kind of partially for the American School and partially in my consulting, but my associate principal, they had figured out sort of a drop-in schedule for Google Meet for any of the synchronous classes that were happening. The other thing that I'd say is shifted in supervision is really what are the forms of evidence of good learning? There's a lot more that you can do in terms of looking for learning by interviewing students and asking teachers to collect some of that evidence themselves. Something I've seen a lot of is when feedback got really popular with Dylan William and a few years back, everyone was doing checks for understanding. But as a supervisor, I'd see people do checks for understanding and then not do anything with the information. And I think online, there's some real opportunities to to collect better data around checks for understanding and create better dialogues with students. So I think there's an opportunity there to get more, as we did today, more polling, more checking, more back channeling that can help you get very direct feedback in the moment.
That's really helpful, and I can just sort of suggest to all of us who are watching today that, you know, we here are looking for ways that we can support you in that work. So, you know, getting the tools and things together that might be able to relook at that evidence. What does evidence look like now that, you know, at least some of the time you're going to need to support that quality teaching through measures that you didn't used to have. We have a couple of people asking about the Marshall framework. Do you have any thoughts to share on that framework and the suggestion to do high frequency and variety of brief evaluations versus a smaller number of longer planned ones? Do you have any thoughts on that?
A little bit, yeah. So something you were just saying about what are the forms of evidence, and really putting the teacher in charge of that as part of your supervisory process, that the teacher can gather other evidence than just what their supervisor does. You know, Kim Marshall has been on this issue for kind of his whole career, is how do you balance the need to see as much teaching as you can in your building with making sure that they're quality visits and that the visit itself impacts learning and impacts the teacher's reflection for the next lesson. And so I really have started to see the supervisory visits as corroborating the bulk of the evidence that's brought by the teacher. And so whether that's through coaching programs or mentorship programs where the teacher has more people in the classroom giving them evidence of the success of the learning, or, you know, just asking a colleague down the hall to come in and say, I'm trying something today, can you give me feedback on it? And probably one of the greatest sources is how do you enlist students and elicit student voice in a real and meaningful way, not just a, you know, end of unit survey, but real and ongoing relationship with students that allows them to give you feedback on how their learning is going. And the supervisor should be dipping in to corroborate that evidence, to say, what I've seen lines up very well with what you're telling me.
Yeah. And again, for those of you who are out there, Ron, we have some videos with Ron doing just that with the teacher, you know. So we have a couple of those on our YouTube channel, and we'll kind of highlight those for you so you can see what that looks like, that we would be using those during our summer programs. We have them, you know, on YouTube for you. We have another question. Are you up for it, Ron?
Sure. Please.
Okay. So how can
I'm not going anywhere.
No. Okay. How can you build in the aspect of giving feedback on behaviors that weren't experienced in any observations, but have been more casually observed? How do we put that on a data sheet as the third point? So I think maybe we're talking about, well, you interpret.
Yeah, I'll make an interpretation because I'm not entirely sure. It seems to me that it's about those things that fall outside of observations that you've heard about a teacher. One, I think you need to do everything you can to create a culture where that information doesn't occur secondhand, but other teachers in the building, parents, students are encouraged to go to the source with a conflict or complaint or issue. That's where it needs to be resolved. So I think a big role of the principal is to sort of help resolve conflict by putting it between the parties who need to have a discussion about it and reach shared understanding. The other thing I would say is that don't let those things add up. And if there's a reason for a conversation with the teacher, have it then and there. You know, whether it's you know, being late for school one day or something, don't build up those things where 3 incidents in, you're going to a teacher and saying, well, you know, this is the 3rd time, because one, you're kind of being unfair and forming a bit of a framework around that teacher without giving them the benefit of letting them know what it is that you're not liking about their performance, or what you need to remind them about their expectations. Don't let it build up, because it builds into resentment that way, and it builds into a bit of a story about that teacher, when really what you should do is provide information on the little things on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Wonderful. And, you know, I would add too that that the standards really help here, because if you have a standard that talks about your conduct, the way you interact, you know, the support that you give to others, if you have that in your standards, if you have something that says, you know, models the values and the values, et cetera, of a global citizen or of a professional, then you have something to fall back on. So instead of walking into a conversation that says, you know, let me talk to you about this episode that I saw, you have, let's talk about standard 2. And what are some of the things that have been going on with regard to standard 2? So it gives you, as a principal, you know, a really important tool. Okay, well, we actually have, do we have any other questions here? Zach, Sky, anything else coming through? We do have questions about, you know, providing resources, et cetera. I have to say that, you know, this one, if you haven't had experience yet with supervision and growth and evaluation, you really, if we ever are able to run a in-person class again, you need to come to one, because really you get to practice all of these skills, you know, in person. Is one of the more challenging ones to try to move off into this you know, remote environment. So we hope we'll get that opportunity sometime next year, not right now. We do have a couple of other questions, quick ones that we can fit in here. Do you have any experience of teachers collecting their own evidence of growth via a professional portfolio? Have you had any experience with that, and has that worked?
Yeah, we've done quite a bit, everything from collecting, you know, hard copy artifacts to one of the things we've found really effective has been keeping a running Google Doc that's shared between participants, and so a supervisor can see it, and the teacher can put anything in there that may come to them through the course of the year, whether it's a coach's observation, a buddy observation, teacher, student feedback, letters from parents, so that at the end of the year they have kind of a place to archive those things. There's probably more elegant ways to do it, but a very simple way to do it is just with a shared Google Doc with links and a folder for that teacher that's shared. It makes for a richer conversation at the end of the year, when the teacher's able to present evidence for the story that they're telling about their growth and where they want to go next.
Thank you so much, Ron. We are